Welcome everybody here in person. Welcome to folks who are watching remotely or the recording. I'm Rob Zaka. I'm Executive Director of Better Eugene-Springfield Transportation. And with me here is...
Vandana Shrestha, AARP, Oregon State Director.
So we're so happy to be hosting Anna Zivarts here tonight. This event's made possible with the generous support of the Oregon Department of Transportation, AARP Oregon, the City of Eugene, and LTD. Please join me in thanking all these great organizations. So Bess does a lot of things. We had, I should introduce Charlotte over here. Charlotte is going to be our visual recorder here and taking notes. Bess has a group called the Cycle of Change, and we had a picnic in her backyard over a year ago, and Anna had just published a book. Can you hold the book up there? When Driving's Not an Option. And some of our volunteers said, wouldn't it be cool if we could bring her to town? So here we are. And I'm not going to say really any more and introduce you because you've got a story to tell, but we are so honored that Anna's joined us. She's just coming off, I'm going to say a little bit. She's just coming off of the National Week Without Driving, which was the end of September through the first week in October, going all over the country, advocating for people's needs who don't drive. And now she's here with us for a couple of days. So let's join us in welcoming, sorry, hang on. Vandana wants to say something special. My bad.
I know this was a last minute edit, so thank you. Thank you so much for making time to let me say a few words. He did ask and say, did you want to say something? I said no, but then I said, yes, I do want to say something. So, you can change your mind. I just want to say thank you so much. ARP, we have lots of members here in Lane County, and we're an organization that serves people 50 plus. And we have had a transition. I just wanted to acknowledge that. We have somebody here in our midst here, Carmel Snyder, Paris Snyder. So Carmel has retired, and I want you all to please thank her for her years of service being a representative, staff representative for AARP, for really forging deep community partnerships and being an advocate for people 50 plus and their families and working on livability issues. And if it were not for Carmel and partners like Best, we wouldn't be here and wouldn't be able to do the great work we do. So thank you so much for your partnership, and thank you, Carmel, for all your work. That's it. I'm leaving.
And without further ado, Anna, the stage is yours.
Hello, it's so good to be here. Thank you so much for hosting me. I've been looking forward to this for a long time. I know Rob and I have been talking about this for a long time, and I'm glad I finally got to join you all tonight. So this is going to be I know where my keys are. Yes, an interactive presentation. And some of you may hear that and be like, oh dear. But I am going to be, and I'm not going to force anyone to share, but I am going to be asking you to share your stories throughout. As a way to learn from each other, and also because I like to learn from you. I feel like I learned so much getting to do this in different parts of the country and in Canada, and get to share what different communities are experiencing. And to be real, it's similar in a lot of places. We face a lot of the same challenges, but let's get into it. So this picture here, and I'm going to do something today just as a practice of accessibility. I'm going to try to verbally describe the images and any text that's on the screen. And I may not always remember to. Sometimes I can't read the text, in which case I'm going to call on people to read it for me. That's my hack. So this first image says, harnessing the expertise of non-drivers, and it's got my name, Anna Zivarts. And then it's an image of two of my friends who live in a part of Washington State in Kitsap County, which I imagine this looks like a lot of roads in Oregon. They're sitting on a rural road. There's no shoulder. There's no sidewalk. Kat is in a power wheelchair. She's low vision, and she's standing next to JR, who is blind, and he has a service animal with him. And they're standing at a bus stop. And this bus stop is just loose gravel. It's got a sign, but that's sort of the only piece of infrastructure. And we were waiting. This is not the bus stop at their house. This was at a friend's house we had gone to visit, who was also blind. And unfortunately, because that bus stop was loose gravel, Kat wasn't able to pull into the stop itself. And so she had to sit in her power wheelchair on the side of this rural road where cars were going 50, 60 miles an hour. And I was terrified for her. And I felt sort of obligated to stand out on the road too, because I felt guilty not, right, being also, exposed to that risk. And then finally the bus driver showed up and we got on the bus and went on our way safely. But just such a powerful reminder to me of the gaps we have in our transportation system. So we're going to get into that a little more. I want to start with, sort of how I came to be with you today. And I'm going to back up so I stop popping this. There we go. This picture on the left of the screen actually looks a lot like that road in Kitsap County. This is the road where my parents live. This is the road I grew up on in Washington State. Also probably looks like a lot of roads in Oregon. Similar rural road, no shoulders, no sidewalks, tall trees. I had no transit where I grew up. And I was born in outside of Olympia, actually. This is rural Thurston County, if you're familiar with Washington State. And I was born with an eye condition called nystagmus, and that makes my eyes shake a little bit all the time. And so what that means is I don't see distance very well. I definitely don't see fast-moving objects. As I look out at you now, and when we do the interactive spot, I'm actually going to have my helpers call on you because I'm not going to be able to see hands. And sometimes I have a white cane that I use in certain situations, mostly just to remind people that I can't see them. I definitely use it when I'm traveling through airports because I've had some interactions with TSA that have been kind of unpleasant. But just a reminder to you all, so if you are trying to get my attention, I can't see you unless you're close up to me. But growing up, I didn't know any other low vision folks, didn't know any other disabled folks. I was pretty isolated and protected. But I also couldn't imagine what life would be like without driving. And so when I was 15, I went to the DMV and I tried to pass the vision test and I failed it. And that was sort of, there wasn't a conversation with my folks about, okay, what does that mean? What are you going to do? How are you going to get around? It was just sort of like, well, we'll drive you. And as a teenager, that is, not what you want to hear. We'll pick you up from the party, right? Not exactly the life you want. So I decided that I was going to learn how to drive anyway. And my best friend decided that she would teach me. And so we took her mom's truck and she knew how to drive her mom's truck, but she was like, I'm going to teach you how to drive stick. We're going to go to the parking lot at Evergreen State College. And we were driving around in circles and I drove the truck up a tree. And that really scared me. We were both not hurt because luckily we were in a parking lot and we weren't going that fast, but it totaled the front of the truck and made me realize that, okay, like this is not going to be a good thing for me to do if I can't drive around a parking lot without hitting a large cedar tree. That's still there. I go back and visit it periodically. So yeah. So that was sort of, but I still couldn't imagine how I was going to live my life. I went to school in the Bay Area and fell in love with transit there. Started taking BART a lot and the regional train there. And then I also, but I was still frustrated because the train stopped running at midnight. And that didn't feel like the kind of life I wanted. I really wanted to be able to go wherever I wanted to go. At that point, it was important to me to be able to go places at midnight. And so I moved to New York City, mostly just because of that transit access, because I had heard there was a subway there and everyone rode it, and it would be normal for me not to drive. And that was wonderful. I lived in New York City for close to 15 years. I know New York City subway system is massively inaccessible with stairs, right? But as someone who could do stairs, it was a system that worked really well for me. And it was easy for me to not tell people about my disability because I didn't have to, right? I didn't have to explain that I couldn't get to their house or I couldn't get to the job or, couldn't apply for the job because it had a driver's license requirement. That was all great. And then in 2016, my son was born and he was diagnosed with the same eye condition shortly after he was born. And that was a shock for me. I had no one in my family thought it was hereditary. My mom had always sort of blamed herself for something she'd done in pregnancy, right? And then suddenly it turns out it's genetic. And I think she felt a lot of relief, but I felt a lot of, that's parenting. Parenting is like that, right? I felt really upset, and I realized that I felt so upset because I wasn't being honest with myself about my disability. I wasn't being honest with many people I interacted with. I was sort of able to hide it really well in New York. And it led me into trying to reach out and connect with the disability community in a way that I really hadn't previous. And that time in 2016, there was a really vibrant disability space on Twitter. I connected to some folks there. It led me to applying for a job back in my home state in Washington at Disability Rights Washington, which is where I worked for the past 7 years. And actually, last week was my last day there, and I'll talk to you more about what's next. But that journey was exciting for me. Right away when I moved back to Washington State, I had grown up in Washington thinking that I was the only person who couldn't drive, which of course wasn't true, but that was sort of the world I was in. And right away, in my cohort of coworkers at Disability Rights Washington, many of my fellow coworkers couldn't drive either. And I was like, oh wow, I'm not alone. There's actually more people. And I started to think, because my time in New York, I'd spent a lot of time working in with labor unions, with service workers and immigrants, about all the people I knew in New York who couldn't drive or couldn't afford to drive. And it made me start to want to sort of document this, to make people feel that, okay, there are a lot more non-drivers out there, that we aren't an insignificant part of the population. And especially if we started to think of ourselves as a collective whole, rather than as separate groups of young people or immigrants or disabled people, we might be able to sort of shift the narrative that everyone drives and driving is how everyone gets everywhere. And so that work really started in earnest in 2020. Before that, I'd been doing video production work for the organization, and then that all sort of changed as the pandemic started, and I asked to see if I could do some transportation-specific work. And so this image on the right is an image of the Transportation Access for Everyone story map that I created starting in 2020. In the first year or two, we interviewed over 300 non-drivers from every legislative district in Washington State. And those interviews are documented on that map. And that led to me writing the book. It led to a couple of white papers that we wrote with those stories. And it led to this political block of organized non-drivers who were able to show up. And when a legislator said to us, oh, well, everyone in my town drives, we could be like, no, this is so-and-so, and they live in Yakima, and they can't drive, and they actually do want sidewalks. And that was, transformational to a degree in the conversations we were able to have with our state legislature. So now we get to be interactive. This is your chance to share, first chance to share. I want you to think about who you know in your life, and maybe that's you, maybe that's a younger version of yourself, who couldn't drive, who can't drive. Maybe it's a family member, a friend, someone in your community. And how they get around. And so you can go ahead and raise your hand. I'm going to have my mic helpers come find you. And while you're thinking about that, I'm going to describe. Actually, let's go ahead. Let's go ahead and do this. Anyone want to share? Yeah.
Hi. I choose not to drive for environmental reasons. One less car on the road, less pollution.
Yes, thank you.
And LTD is great, and it's a great walking city too.
Mm-hmm. That's great to hear. And yes, so as we talk about non-drivers, right, there's this distinction, but it's not a strict binary, right, between voluntary and involuntary, right? And there's all sort of gradations of choice, right? And so people who choose not to drive are part of this non-driver community. Who else wants to share?
I do not drive. My daughter has not learned to drive, and she's not sure if she wants to. All of the kids who live on my street downtown do not drive. They're too young. My stepmother has stopped driving because her vision has gotten too bad. My father is considering not driving because of his strength and awakeness issues.
Mm-hmm.
And some of my fellow board members at the Downtown Neighborhood Association do not drive for various reasons. We're all over the place.
Yeah. Thank you. You just covered so many categories of non-drivers that I want to talk about. So young people, right? People who are too young to drive. There's an image here on the bottom right of the screen of my kid and another kid on our block waiting for the school bus. I think we often sort of disregard young people, possibly because they don't vote, or we assume that they need to have someone else traveling with them, and therefore we're not going to count them. But some adults need someone else to travel with them, right? And they're still people, and they still need to go places. And I'm a firm believer that we should count children when we count, who is a driver and who is a not driver. And the other part of that too is, like in this picture, right? The kids are waiting for the school bus. We create transportation systems for kids recognizing that not every kid has a parent or caregiver who can drive them everywhere they need to go always. That's why we fund or used to fund or increasingly less funding, school bus systems for kids. So children, right? And then young people, you mentioned your kids not driving. Young people also, this picture on the upper right is some folks waiting for the bus in Seattle. These are young people. In Washington State, we have free transit for everyone under the age of 18 currently, which is pretty exciting. But not just in Washington State, nationally, there's been a big decrease in young people, people who are old enough to drive, choosing not to get a driver's license right away. From when I was a teenager in the 90s, it was about 50% of 16-year-olds got their driver's license. It's currently down to about 25% of 16-year-olds go out and get their driver's license at 16. So that's a big shift, and I think a really exciting shift. All right, who wants to share? Anybody else?
I have a niece who cannot drive due to vision issues. And so she's in an area where there's not very good transit, and she has to have people drive her around. And then in Cresswell, I've worked with 8 homeless people who cannot afford to drive.
Yeah.
And maybe some other issues too. And I know other people who are employed in Cresswell who can't afford to drive because they just don't make enough money to rent a car and have insurance and all that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, affordability is one of the largest groups of non-drivers. Youth, right? People who are too young to drive, but then people who can't afford to. It's just, the car ownership is increasingly expensive. Other things are increasingly expensive. And we really saw, at least up in my neighborhood in Seattle, in this picture on the top middle, is folks wait on the bus during the pandemic on the 7 bus, which is a bus that serves my neighborhood, serves a lot of low wage, essential worker and immigrant communities, right? And we saw ridership on that bus really didn't decrease much during the pandemic, even when many people were really afraid to ride transit because of COVID, because people didn't have other options, right? They could not afford to own a car and drive places. And so they're still riding the bus. And, because of the racialized nature of poverty in our country, right? We know that Black households are 3 times less likely to have a car than white households. That's nationally. And also immigrant households with recent immigrants are 7 times less likely to have a car. So big disparities there in who is not able to drive and also more likely to be relying on transit and walking and biking and rolling to get around. The other part you mentioned too was disability, and I want to talk about Erica, who's pictured in the middle bottom. And I think this is also, I share Erica's story because I think it shows that there's a complexity here, right? And again, it's like driving and not driving is not always a strict binary. Erica uses a mobility chair, a power chair, and she can drive, and she can drive a vehicle without hand controls, but she can't afford a vehicle that accommodates her wheelchair. And so she's not able to drive. And so understanding that there's also a lot of poverty in the disability community and that those things are also connected. But that also driving, for some disabled folks, right, it could work in some situations. Maybe you have a chronic health condition, you can drive some days and not others. Maybe like my mom, you can drive during the day, but you can't drive at night anymore. You could also not at all identify as disabled and have, access needs that are related to driving, like anxiety or PTSD that's triggered by driving, and so makes driving, if not impossible, really uncomfortable or really not a safe choice for you. So, and then understanding there's all kinds of disabilities, right, that can make driving not safe or not comfortable, whether that's vision disabilities, mobility disabilities, epilepsy, traumatic brain injuries. I feel like every time I sort of try to list them, I forget some. But if anyone else has any other experiences they want to share of their own, or anyone else they know who can't drive. Yeah.
I am glad to.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm glad to see you indicate the difference between choosing or can't driving and choosing not to drive, because I certainly can drive and I have a license, but chose to move really central and have good bikes and access. And so that's my choice, probably because of the environment and definitely safety. You mentioned the
PTSD, yeah.
Right. I was in a bad car accident at age 23, life-changing,
Yeah.
definitely. And so driving's just not that fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. There's one more. There's two more pictures on the screen, and I want to share these because I think it illustrates the sort of the choice piece, right? And how, again, it's nuanced. These are the pictures on the far left of the screen are images of my two grandmas. They're both passed away now. And they were both essentially non-drivers in the latter parts of their lives. On the upper left is my grandma on my mom's side, who had developed vision disabilities, right? And couldn't drive for the last 30 or so years of her life. And she intentionally moved from Long Island to Honolulu. And lived in Waikiki, where she could walk everywhere and take the bus. That's a picture of me visiting her in Hawaii. It was great. And actually, I was just back there for a talk 2 weeks ago, and the bus system, it's called The Bus in Honolulu, is really excellent. It has, I guess, 96% of their population in Oahu has transit access, which I thought is amazing. And now I want to be my grandma and retire in Honolulu. My other grandma on the bottom here had a heart condition for the last 10 years or so of her life that would cause her to pass out sort of without notice. She would just, lose circulation. She lived in southern rural Indiana and on a farm, and she had a lot of animals. There's her and one of her dogs there. And she did not want to move into a nursing home and give up her animals. And so she decided she was just going to keep driving, and no one in the family, she was very, very stubborn. Nobody could stop her. And so she would drive, and a couple of times she passed out while driving and drove off the road into a ditch. But luckily was in such a rural area that she never hit anything. And someone, the cops would usually find her, or someone would find her right off the side of the road somewhere, and she'd wake up and she'd be okay. But a lot of that had to do with her not having the option to stay where she was because there were no more local services in the community that she had lived in. That everything required driving 20, 30 miles into a larger town. So, anyone else, non-drivers in your families, or your experience being a non-driver?
So I have to finally admit that I am a non-driver. I have steadily been dependent on a mobility device, but recently, last year when I had brain surgery, my right side of my body doesn't do what I want it to do, so not safe for me to drive. But it's interesting because as someone who used to drive and now is a non-driver, it's just finding that connection, that transition has been a little bit harder. I'm fortunate that my husband drives me everywhere, but it's not really fair to him. So I'm learning to look at bus schedules and things like that, but I am moving to rural Washington. So I don't know.
Yeah.
We'll have to see.
It's tricky, right? And, especially when you're not gonna be able to drive in the long term, like the choices you make. And, and then, yeah, I also dream of living somewhere. As much as I dream of living in like Honolulu, I also dream of living somewhere really rural. But like, what would that mean, right? And as far as relying on other people and community service drivers. So choices, right? And hard to figure out because there aren't a lot of options, I think, because we do assume that driving is normal. This is despite the fact, and I always start sort of with these stories from you all, because if I start with the statistic, people are like, nah, can't be. But a third of people in the US are non-drivers. There's some new research that came out 2 weeks ago now from NRDC, and they found it's actually even higher than that, 36.6% of the population over the age of 10. They wanted to cut off the youngest children. I think it's a weird way to divide things, but whatever, are non-drivers nationally. I looked for the Oregon statistics, and you can find this if you Google NRDC car ownership. Their new report comes out. You can play around with the data at the state level. 33.6% of people in Oregon do not have a personal vehicle for daily use, and that's people over the age of 10. And then that also found, 73% of people with disabilities don't drive for most of their trips, and that's in Oregon from that data from NRDC. So there's a lot of us, and yet I think we are often an afterthought. And I think that has to do with a lot of, because we tend to be older people, poorer people, disabled people, immigrants, right? People who are perhaps have suspended licenses, children. There's a lot of reasons, right, that people with disabilities and others who can't afford to drive, right, or aged out of driving are not considered valid, having valid transportation needs. And this picture on the right is actually the very crowded, the bus in Oahu. I couldn't believe how many people were riding the transit system there. So how do people who can't drive, how do non-drivers get around? We had some research funded in Washington State 2 years ago, came out in 2023, around non-driver populations. And that not only found that around 30% of our population in Washington State are non-drivers, also we dug in a little bit deeper about how people get around and what it feels like to be a non-driver. And that research found that actually most non-drivers in Washington State are not necessarily living in areas with good transit, right? They're not people who live in Seattle and who can take the light rail everywhere they want to go or bike places. For a majority of non-drivers, we are relying on friends and family for rides. And so I think that's an important thing to acknowledge, especially because so much of our country is so car dependent. So what I talk about here is, and what we found in that study, and what I've heard in the interviews I've done with non-drivers and what I hear when I talk to groups around the country is really that relying on rides from other people isn't always easy, right? It comes with an emotional burden. You always feel like you owe people something. You always feel like you have to trade or offer something in exchange. It feels like you're sort of asking for permission. And there's a quote here from Jaime Torres, who's a non-driver from Washington State, and there's an image of him. I'm going to have someone read this quote for me, so you're going to volunteer to read the quote and then share an example of what it felt like to ask someone for a ride. And it could be someone who normally drives, but what it felt like to have to rely on someone else for a ride and what you felt like maybe you had to offer in exchange. Anyone want to share?
Read it.
Yeah, read the quote and then share your story.
The emotional burden of asking for rides. It is beyond frustrating having to depend on others for transportation. It really affects me to the point where it's easier to just isolate myself in my room so I don't feel like a burden. That's Jamie Torres. My daughter, Bethany, was recently in a car accident. It totaled her car. She's fine, but she found herself without transportation now. And she's a school teacher in Woodburn. They have a wonderful bus system, and she was trying to figure out how to get home from Woodburn back to Junction City where we lived. And I said, well, there's a bus, the point, and you can pick it up in Woodburn and come back. And so she rode the bus, and she really, really was excited about that there was a bus to come down. It was like $13. So she found herself in a spot where she couldn't drive, and now even just without a vehicle, and because I work for LTD, she has a bus pass, and so now she gets to learn how the bus route works.
That's great. That's exciting. Thank you, and thank you for reading Jaime's story. Anyone else want to share what it felt like to ask someone for a ride recently? Anyone have that experience? I saw a hand on this side. Okay, we can move on. Oh, we got one.
I feel like a little bit of an imposter as I don't drive by choice. I can drive, but so our kids grew up without having a car, and I would have to ask people sometimes. Usually we didn't, we were really self-reliant, but I would have to ask people sometimes if our son had an out of town soccer game, and that was like horrible for me as an introvert to ask somebody for a ride, and I didn't know how. I couldn't say, oh, you drive this week, I'll drive next week. So I don't know, it was like the hardest thing about not owning a car was having to ask people for rides. And the other part of the experience was people feeling sorry for me sometimes. And I didn't want that. I felt really good about not having a car, but people just didn't get it. So there's that feeling of like, oh, you poor thing, So it was actually quite hard for me. And it was a choice for me. So I can imagine it might even be another layer if you don't have the choice.
Yeah, the kids sports things. When we do talk about Week Without Driving, which I'll talk about in a little bit, that's actually some of the responses we get most often from elected officials who participate is, oh my gosh, I could do everything but, soccer, hockey practice, whatever, name your, kids' sports activity that happens to be way out of town, not on transit at odd hours, lots of equipment, all of that. So this is sort of an obvious one, but if you can't drive, and it can be frustrating to always have to rely on sort of negotiating these favors to get rides places. Transit really can be give you a sense of freedom. And there's an image here of Abby Griffith, who is a non-driver from Washington State. She actually lives in Portland now, so she's in one of yours in Oregon. But she grew up in rural Washington like I did, with a single mom who could not drive her places when she was in high school. She just didn't have time. And so Abby was really depressed and frustrated, and then finally was able to move into Vancouver, Washington onto a bus route. And now she organizes transit riders in Portland. But does anyone want to share a story of, you can read Abby's quote and then tell me an example of where transit goes in your community and where it doesn't go, maybe in relation to you, relation to other people, relation to the affordability of housing, any of those stories. Raise your hand. Who wants to share? And you can start just the easy part by reading Abby's quote.
The room I rented was right next to bus number 30. It was life-changing for me to know that I have access to places. Abby Griffith. So
yeah.
I can't drive. I'm legally blind. And there were some years in between when I stopped driving and when I felt like I could stop riding a bike. And when I could ride a bike, I felt like I had access to this community. But the example that comes to mind is, LTD, our bus system is really good if you're trying to get downtown or to the university at the popular times, and can be really challenging other times. But I have a recurring work commitment every several months that used to be held in Junction City. And at some point I realized, oh, I can just take the bus up there. It's totally convenient. It's at the right time. And then it moved to Harrisburg, and our bus system is by the county, and there's nothing to Harrisburg. So to go to Harrisburg, you have to go with someone when they're driving.
Yeah, that is tricky. How far is Harrisburg? 6. Oh man, but just a little further. Yeah.
Too far to walk.
Too far. I'm repeating this for the folks online. Too far to walk, about 6 miles, but not that far, right? Yeah, dangerous. So, and I'm sure I'm going to hear more transit stories as we keep going. What I think is often overlooked when we talk about transit access, right, is that we can't just talk about transit in a vacuum, even though transit agencies are often really separate from the rest of our transportation system, right? Our sidewalks and our crossings, and honestly, our land use, right? Where housing gets built, where services get located. We're not always planning these all together. And we're not always, our priorities aren't always aligned across agencies that do this work. And the person who really helped me understand this the most, because I'm someone, who can do stairs, who if there's no sidewalk, I can kind of, make it work, especially before I had a kid. The person who really helped me understand this was Crystal Monteros. And there's a quote here from Crystal. I'm going to have someone read, and then I'm also going to have you share a story. And I know there's some folks here from the Curbs advocacy group, who care deeply about sidewalk access. So sharing an example of a place where there isn't great sidewalk access near a transit stop. But before we do that, I'll just describe this image. This is Crystal Montero. She's a wheelchair user who is meeting with some elected officials, trying to get them to build a sidewalk to connect to the bus stop outside her apartment complex in Tacoma, Washington. So does anyone want to read Crystal's story and then share an example of a missing sidewalk, inaccessible sidewalk near transit? Making you guys get your
Hello,
exercise.
I'm Larry Craig.
Yes.
I am with that very committee, United to Repair Our Broken Sidewalks. I'm a longtime manual wheelchair user. I've been using a wheelchair since 1970 following a vehicle accident. I can't speak directly to the inability to access a bus stop per se, but what I can say, in various neighborhoods, our sidewalks are damaged here in Eugene to the extent that it's difficult to transit from block to block en route to that bus stop. People often don't know that it's the responsibility of the property owner to maintain the sidewalks adjacent to their property. Even though it's public infrastructure in Eugene, that's the city ordinance. We have a complaint process, but it's challenging to access. It's online and you kind of have to burrow to get to it. And there's really not a sense of follow-up in regard to the amount of funds it takes committed to follow up to ensure those sidewalks are repaired. So it falls on the liability of the property owner or the fear or risk once a complaint's been generated to be repaired.
Yeah. Sidewalk repairs.
Excuse me,
Oh, yeah, go
my
ahead.
holder had a sneeze here.
Yeah.
Bless you. So thank you.
Yeah. And are you able to read Crystal's quote, or do you want someone else to do that?
I apologize.
Nope, you're good.
Sidewalks and transit together. We need to start thinking about public transportation and sidewalks as going together instead of as two separate things. You can't use the bus if you can't get yourself to the bus stop. Crystal Monteros.
Thank you, Larry. And yes, sidewalk maintenance. And it's, it's such a problem. Seattle, 50% of our streets in Seattle are either missing sidewalks or their sidewalks are inaccessible. I think most communities I talk to have this problem. And because it's often seen, right, as the responsibility of the private property, adjacent property owner versus as a public responsibility to maintain those. Denver's trying something new and actually trying to, they passed a funding package to publicly repair sidewalks and build missing ones. So I have a little hope there, but we'll see how that goes for them. There's a lot of work to do. There's a couple of pictures here that I'll describe just for some other examples of sidewalks. So the picture on the right is my former colleagues, Tanisha and Cecilia, who are wheelchair users, trying to navigate an uplift in the Seattle sidewalk. And then the other one is floating scooter share, which is a big issue in Seattle with misparked scooters. And I was actually really excited I rode the bike share over here. Was pretty excited to learn that you guys actually have a lock-to system where you are required to lock your bikes to something so they can't just be parked everywhere in the middle of the sidewalks, which we see so much in so many cities that have this free-floating scooter and bike share programs. Does anyone else want to share a sidewalk story or a crossing story? This next slide kind of gets into the challenges of crossings that are not prioritizing the movement of pedestrians.
Yeah, so I'm kind of cheating. I actually drive the bus. But on our route 36, I was so excited. I drive it on Thursdays only. And when I came around onto Bertelsen, I can see that the city's putting in sidewalks. I really kudos to the city. There's trailer parks down there, people that are in wheelchairs that need those sidewalks to go up to the store, get up to 11th. That's really cool. Now all the bus stops are going to have sidewalks. So
that's great. Yay. Great to hear. So this next slide, talks about crossings, right? Because I think we think about sidewalks and that connectivity, but we also need to be thinking about crossings, and in particular, crossings that are next to frequent transit for people who can't drive. These pictures here is my pet peeve intersection in Seattle, and I was actually just talking to it was Ed, I believe, on about I-5 that goes through Eugene and some of the problems with the on and off ramps. This is a situation similar in Seattle. This is I-90. It's actually I-90 and I-5 are right there, kind of merging. But we also built a light rail station in the middle of this cloverleaf. And so, yeah, it's cheap to build light rail down the middle of highway right-of-ways, but it doesn't necessarily create a lovely experience for people using that and trying to get to that light rail. And unfortunately, when they drew the station designs, they sort of excluded all the on and off ramps that were right outside what they considered sort of what they needed to do for station accessibility. And so to access the station on the flat level, You can also, there's a second entrance that's way up a hill, but for people, especially people with, children or mobility disabilities, the entrances that most people are going to be using require you crossing these unsignalized, so there's no light, on and off ramps. And there's not a lot of visibility. So this is a picture on the left of one of those off ramps. And there's another picture next to it of my friend Micah, who was there on a walk roll audit with us. And there's what he thought was an accessible pedestrian signal. So we went over to try to push the button to get a signal to cross. And it turns out it's just a sign that says use caution while crossing. And has a little picture of a bike and a pedestrian on it. And so you're playing, you're basically trying to dodge the cars that are coming off this ramp at highway speeds. So we've done over the last 5-6 years now, many walk roll audits along here with elected officials. We got a federal RAISE grant to study some design changes. And so that process is happening now, and we'll come up with a consensus around possibly closing some of the ramps, which I'm really, really excited about, and installing signals. So then we'll have to go and find the funding to do that. But I'm sure, you can all think of many, and Micah commented there's a quote here from Micah that says, let's see, so they can't see us and I can't see them. That's tough, yes. I'm sure you can all think of crossings in your communities that are like this, whether or not they're highway crossings. I was just in Texas talking to their DOT about pedestrian safety, and they found that, some of the highest conflict points, right, are when they put bus stops mid-block, and then people are crossing mid-block because that's where the bus stops are, rather than, going a mile or half a mile out of the way, right, to go down and find a light to cross. And so as a safety measure, they're actually relocating some of the bus stops to where there are, signals. Hopefully there's also where there's, that's where the stores and where the people need to go. But, thinking about how can we reduce conflict, right? And how can we also prioritize the movement of pedestrians, especially in Yale Transit. Does anyone have a crossing story they want to share? A crossing that you have to navigate that you find particularly gnarly?
In Cresswell to the south here, small town, we have a number of roads that are 3-4 lane and speeds 35, 45 miles an hour. And it is tough to get across, even if you're on a bicycle. People come around the corner and you can be in the lane and they're going 45. You can't get out of the way. It's tough.
Yeah. Yeah, especially when there's 2 lanes, right, of the same direction, and then one car might yield and the other lane, what happens, right? That was a situation on one of these ramps here that we finally got our DOT to close, one of the lanes. But yeah. So everything I've sort of talked about so far is really, thinking about the transportation side of the equation, but I think the other half, right, is the land use side. And if we're just talking about how people get where they need to go, we're ignoring the other half of like, where do people live? Where can people afford to live? And then where are the locations that they need to get to? And what are those distances, right? Part of this, right, is what we're doing around where we have existing transit, right? If we're building out, BRT, if we're building out light rail, what is the land use options around where that transit exists? And there's 2 pictures here on the screen of these are giant parking lots near light rail stations. The one on the left is in Washington, D.C. I think this is out in Maryland, one of the stations that's further out the train there. And then on the one on the right is my neighborhood in Seattle, where we're building a light rail station next to this very large, very empty parking lot. And so thinking about, what would it take to create more opportunities for people to live where transit exists, right? Because we all know that housing is such a cost, a high cost. And for many of the people that I work with who can't afford cars or can't drive, they also can't afford to live anywhere near light rail or anywhere near frequent transit in the Seattle area. And so thinking about that piece specifically is so important. And I'm not going to get into all the housing solutions we can talk about, but just understanding that it is also and equally as important as thinking about the transportation pieces. The other sort of hack, then this is back to the transportation side of the equation, because that's sort of my expertise, is thinking about e-mobility. And I say this sort of in a broad sense. I'm not just talking about e-bikes or e-trikes. I also want to talk about power wheelchairs and scooters, right? When we're thinking about e-mobility and access. What options, how can we make sure that more people have affordable options to use smaller mobility devices, whether that's e-bikes or e-trikes or mobility scooters or power wheelchairs that meet their needs, and that we have the infrastructure to do so safely. And so I think, often in spaces that I'm in, the biking community often gets pitted against the disability community, and that's tricky. There are definitely a lot of conflict points, but I think it's also, we forget sometimes that there are a lot of disabled people who can't drive, for whom biking is actually an option. And there's a couple of pictures here of some people that I know. On the top is Cody Shane, who has intellectual disabilities and lives up in a rural community in Washington called Chewelah, and he uses a trike to get around his community. Below that is Ivy, who lives in the greater Tucson area and has the same condition I do. And like me, she can bike. The bottom right is my friend and Rachel and I. Rachel has a vision condition and also has had some epilepsy, and so she can't drive, and so she bikes to get around. And then on the top right are some of my friends in Seattle, my coworkers at Disability Rights Washington, using power chairs and manual chairs to get around. But thinking how do we make sure that we have e-mobility options that are available? Can we make sure that accessible adaptive e-trikes and e-bikes are available to people, that there's safe places to store them, to charge them, and that when we're designing bike infrastructure and multi-use infrastructure, that infrastructure works for the full range of devices people might have. So this is, again, sort of a thing I'm not going to get into super deep today, but just understanding that this is also part of that mobility conversation, that especially when there are places without good, reliable transit, and because so many of our communities are so spread out in the West, that having that e-boost can really make the difference between being able to get somewhere and not get somewhere. Maybe I'll take one. Does one or two people want to share any stories around smaller mobility devices like e-bikes or e-trikes or mobility scooters, power wheelchairs, and how that has improved your access or the access of someone you know? Anyone have any stories?
I was just going to say that we recently got e-bikes, and it's for choice. It's not that we needed them, but it has improved our access to the entire city so much, and they are a game changer. So I can just imagine for anybody that would need a vehicle like that has the electric power, it just makes the distance from point A to point B so much easier to get to. And we live kind of outside of town, and now we can easily bike into town because the distance is not as big of an issue. So it's a big thing, and I think that having access to those kinds of vehicles are really important.
Yep. Yeah.
It says reduce the distances we need to travel. More affordability means moving further out. Moving further out means more limited transportation, and that's exactly for us because it was more affordable to live farther out.
Yep.
And that is Von Braun.
Thank you. Yeah, and I went on to the next slide. So this slide really, it does address that, how those distances, right, and e-mobility perhaps solving some of those distances, but also housing, right, housing and services. And these two pictures here, the bottom picture is some townhomes near where I live in Seattle, where there is light rail, that are selling for close to $1 million a piece, right? And so it has that the transit access, but the affordability is not there. So really thinking about how do we make sure that we have the affordability, especially near transit. The top image, and I shared the story of my grandma in Southern Indiana living in a community where all the services had left. And this is not true. This is not just true of our rural communities, right? This is also true of many urban and suburban areas that are food deserts, that are pharmacy deserts, right? That don't have childcare, that don't have healthcare options. This was the hardware store in the town where she lived. And it no longer is a hardware store. There is nothing in this community even anymore, even though the population has remained the same. Everyone just drives 30 miles into the next nearest town now. And so thinking about how can we make sure those services exist where people need them is also part of this. All right. And all right. So solutions. I'm going to wrap this up with a couple of, here's what I think we can do. And I would love to hear, your thoughts too. And if we don't have time to share them all in a larger group, you can come talk to me afterwards. But I think, part of what I'm most excited about in how we change our communities, right, is first of all, understanding the gaps in the transportation systems and the housing needs and the services that exist. But also, I think at the end of the day, what I'm most excited about is making sure that people who have the experience of not being able to drive are at the table, especially people for whom it's not an easy choice, right? Who really can't afford to or can't drive. I want to have more of those voices at our planning and policymaking tables. And unfortunately, and there's a quote here from an elected official who participated in Week Without Driving, who was reflecting on the fact that for most elected officials in most parts of our country, there's an expectation that you drive. Like you have to be able to get places really quickly and be a bunch of places. And so that means that people like me and other people who can't drive don't have the opportunity, or it's a higher bar to try to get elected. And so we're not in those rooms very often. So what are the things we can do? One thing, easy ask, are walk and roll audits, bringing disabled community members and other non-drivers into the room where planning conversations are happening, going out and experiencing transportation as someone walking, rolling, biking. And there's a picture here on the right of one of those that WashDOT was doing in Vancouver, Washington, with some disabled community members. The project that I am personally most excited about right now is about how do we actually change some of these decision-making structures, right? If we're not able to get elected, if we're not able to get non-drivers into elected office, how do we make sure that people who rely on transit are actually represented on our transit boards? In Washington State previously, you had to be an elected official to be, have a vote on our transit agency boards. And so we changed that last year, this last session, with a new law. And so the organization that I'm working for now is going to be actively trying to recruit and train transit riders to serve on some of these boards, so that we have that perspective in the room when elected officials are there and talking about, oh, okay, are we going to do a tax cut and cut Sunday transit service? Or not. And there's someone in the room that can be like, yeah, actually transit service on Sundays is a good thing. I use it and I know other people who do. Because unfortunately, we've had a lot of conversations in our state, especially in smaller communities lately, where there haven't been people who use transit in these rooms where we're deciding about transit funding. So there's a map here of the transit agencies that are covered by this new law that will have the opportunity to appoint transit riders. So I'm excited about it, and I'm excited that it covers a lot of eastern parts of our state as well. So it's not just the Puget Sound region. We're going to be actively organizing transit riders in more rural and historically more conservative parts of our state. Oh yeah, and there's a quote here from Lindsay Shorman Warren, who is an elected official who was on a transit board and realized very clearly that transit rider voice was missing as a result of his participation in Week Without Driving, and became a huge ally of ours in passing this legislation this last year. Another thing, if you are with an organization or an agency that has the opportunity to hire people, is to hire people who have the experience of being non-drivers, and think about what sorts of employment requirements you have and how many of those are necessary and how many of those are just creating barriers and excluding people, like a driver's license requirement or the requirement to be able to lift 40 pounds, right? Like really, there's these sort of legacy, the requirements that are stuck in our HR systems often without people even realizing they're populating into job descriptions that we really need to examine. And then finally, the Week Without Driving. And you saw as you came in, I was playing a reel of TV highlight clips from this year's week that just wrapped up. But it's our sort of entry-level step in engaging elected officials and engaging the public with what does it mean to be a non-driver if you're someone who normally drives? What would your experience be like getting around your community? And there's an image here of my kid and another neighborhood kid riding the bus. So weekwithoutdriving.org is where you could learn more about that. I have some stickers if you want to come grab one from me. Next year's event will be next September, so we're almost a full year out. You have a lot of time to start organizing for next year if you're interested in joining us. But we have, both in Washington State and across the country and in Canada too, really seen it be a way to bring in and engage with elected officials and engage with agencies and get people talking about non-drivers and thinking about the community members that they know who can't drive. So I'm going to end it there. If you do want to come talk to me about what your experience would be a week without driving, you can come find me at the table. But now I'm going to hand it back over to Rob because we have another exciting point of this presentation. And there's my contact info as well, if anyone wants to be in touch. Thank you.
Let's thank Anna so much. Don't go too far. This is sort of the community response section. And Merrick Knudsen, why don't you come on up? And maybe Pete, you're on deck. Just thought that we would have some local thought leaders just reflect a little bit on what you heard and what we're doing here, what we're not doing here, what it suggests, really just a moment or so of reactions. Kind of first thoughts, first impressions.
First thoughts, first impressions. Really brilliant, wonderful presentation, and so many great touch points for us as a community. I especially love centering the voices of people who are needing access to mobility options and great transportation options and great transit. The other idea that I was reflecting on during the whole of your presentation, and as it relates to our community, is how much Eugene prides itself on being a great place to grow up and raise a family, and how important it is to us that we are a place that is welcoming to our elders and our grandparents, and how many people are hoping that their grandparents are going to move closer to them in our community, and thinking how important this work is to the way that we see ourselves as our best selves, not just as our infrastructure investments, but really as a reflection of the values of a community that cares about being accessible to young kids and it being a delightful and safe experience, and accessible to middle-aged kids and having it be a rapid and reliable experience, and then accessible to people who are older and who are our elders, who also want to feel like they have freedom to get to everywhere that they need to go in their day. So I love this vision, and there are things we're doing to work on this specifically, the connections between our sidewalks work and LTD. I know our staff is excited by this work. It's powerful to me as your mayor to have such a fantastic advocacy group mobilized around sidewalk accessibility and curbs, but that is true across all of our transportation modes and advocacy that BEST has also been a part of making possible. So we're going to keep working on it, and I think we have some good projects in the pipeline that connect to this.
Thank you, Eugene, Mayor Karen Knudsen. Why don't we get Pete? Do you want to come up? Pete Knox is a member of the LTD Board of Directors. And I guess to imitate you, Anna, I should say, Pete is coming up on the stage here and is using walking. Introduce yourself, Pete.
Well, thanks for that introduction. Thank you, Rob, and thank you, Anna, for your talk. And apparently, I'm not close enough to the microphone. So part of my story is that I am also a lifetime transit user. I have similar eyesight reasons, not quite the same as hers, but being able to get around using transit it has its challenges and ups and downs, but it's functionally doable. I spent 10 years in Seattle as serving time in the software industry. I had the hour and a half commute from Queen Anne Hill over to Redmond. It was an hour and a half each way, so that was a lot of fun. And my friends who drove that, they weren't that happy. Driving on freeways, commuting, getting stuck in traffic, it's hard. People hate it, but they don't see that there is an alternative. They don't think about that because the messaging is relentless. You need to be a driver. You have to own the biggest truck you could possibly buy. You know, if you watch a Seahawks game, you're going to see 3 hour truck ad permeated by a couple football plays. And at the same time, since World War II, we have been building our infrastructure, land use, transportation around the car, for better or for worse. And I think it was all started with good intention. But today, the amount of people, the amount of cars, and the overburden of having to paying for infrastructure that, you know, costs a fortune to keep up. Some suburbs were built in the 1950s and 60s are financially failing because they have they can't pay for the roads because their tax base isn't strong enough to do that. So there needs to be another way. And we need to have the message get out. And I know this crowd here is pretty friendly to the idea of not being different modes of transportation and not being a full-time driver. But those of us who are leaders in transportation and land use, and we need to go out there. We need to change that message. We need to be as relentless as Ford and Chevy in saying, you know, there is another way. Now, I'm not trying to replace the car, but I want everybody to have the opportunity to do something different and improve their lives. And let's make sure that we could have the opportunity for people to live, work, and play and be happy.
Thank you, Pete. That's a great message. Lisa, State Representative Lisa Fragula, would you like to come up and say a few words? Having just come back recently from your first special session in Salem and talking about, well, what did you hear that connects with your work? Or not?
Are you talking about the transportation package?
What are your experiences?
Sure. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Anna. I'm also an elementary educator of close to 25 years, and I just really appreciated how you led the program tonight, engaging people with the policy work, both in our heads and our hearts. So that was wonderful. So yes, the transportation package. I think I would start off by saying, you know, listening to the presentation tonight, there was so much work in the original TRIP, Transportation Reinvestment Package, that we worked on in the 2025 session that would have addressed many of these issues much better than the package we ended up with. Right, myself and other members of the Environmental Caucus, we actually pushed really hard during the session to move the transportation package in a direction that included investments in safe routes to schools, right? Sidewalks, kids get to school safely. A larger investment in transit, which is so critical, you know, in a city like Eugene, where people don't assume it's critical. Investments in greater streets, right? If people are gonna be able to walk and roll, we need safe pathways and alternative pathways for our community. So we had much of that in the original TRIP package, which I am really proud of the fact we got it out of the House, but it couldn't find its way out of the Senate. I'm also proud of the fact that we came back and we fought to get the funding that we did get in the special session. And most importantly for me in that funding is the fact that 50% of it goes to cities and counties. 50% of the funding will come to the city of Eugene and Tulane County to work on those safety projects, to, consider some of the curb work, and for the county to work on some of the most dangerous highways. So we didn't get as far as we hoped, as I personally hoped, but we took a small bite out of the apple, which is what I'm learning is part of being a state legislator. It's lots of nibbling. And fortunately, I'm persistent, and I will try to keep nibbling away. The other thing that this really made me reflect on, which is not something people might automatically have pop in their mind, is that how significant just access to your elected officials is impacted by the issues that we were speaking about tonight. For those of you who have been in my office in Salem, it's not accessible to somebody who has a driving mobility device. Maybe the Senate has room. We don't have room in the House. The offices are tiny. So people don't have access to me in my office. I will meet with them downstairs in the hallway. I got to know some mobility device users in this last year, and worked hard to plan a community event that I knew was on a transit line so they could come. Silly me, I planned it on a Saturday or a Sunday. The bus line didn't run on that day, right? They couldn't access me as an elected official. And then recently I had another experience, not here locally, but with another elected who invited me to come speak at a senior retirement community. And we were told the day before we couldn't come because management was concerned that we were too political. We offered to meet with residents at another location. Many of those residents couldn't access us because of their transportation needs. So just a small thought to remind us that access to our elected officials really relies on these transportation systems as well. So thank you very much for being here tonight, and thank you again. And thanks, Best, for these great opportunities.
Thank you, Representative Fragula. Maybe we'll bring up one more voice. James Otten, CEO of LTD. Do you want to share anything you've heard, or maybe what LTD is thinking of doing, or whatever comes to mind? Okay. No more than 22 minutes, okay?
We'll go 24. Well, is it Anna or Anna? Anna, thank you. Thank you for your great presentation. I'm a fan and I'm in the camp. And I think most of us in this room are in this congregation wanting to see mobility options play out well in our community. One thing that I would point out is I do not want to see any 11-year-old driving. I'm happy that they're non-drivers, 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15. I think the American Community Survey uses 16 and over to look at commute patterns. And what do you see when you see public transportation in that survey? I think it's about 4%, 3.7, 3.8, somewhere in there. You back out some big cities, Chicago, New York, Philadelphia, it goes down even lower, doesn't it? It goes down even lower. I think there's an opportunity for us to talk to the non-transit users, the 98% or so that don't use transit, because the ones who do use transit know the value to them. The ones who don't use transit may not know the value that they receive as well. And when you're having that conversation in that context, then it makes it easier for folks like Rep. Fragula and for our mayor to say, hey, let's make these critical investments in areas that we may not invest in because they don't pencil out. Case in point, where is it easier, where is it cheaper to live? It's where transit doesn't go very well, right? Because it's farther out. It's farther out from where we sit right now. It pencils out differently. We're going through a process right now at LTD where we're assessing that. We're assessing what does a total system look like? What does it look like if we could serve our rural communities to the extent they need to be able to do the things that Pete mentioned, to have fun, right? To have fun. What does that look like? What's that cost? And let's have an open, frank transparent conversation around the investment there. And that way we can give our elected officials the tools that they need to look at legislation that will meet the needs of our community. But we have to do that as a community. I carry around the picture with me from October of 2016. I was in at a conference in Chicago, and a bunch of folks showed up with walkers, wheelchairs, and they were holding signs that say, "We will ride." That's right when Uber got big. And they're looking at the TNCs and saying, "Hey, you're going to be accessible because we're going to ride." I carry that picture for a reason. We have to start with that design, with understanding that our folks that need the service the most, that have the highest unemployment rate, right? We have to design with them as the core and design out from there. So what does that mean? It means good sidewalks. It means good curb cuts. It means good places where they can wait for a vehicle. It means bike paths that they can use without, I'm looking at you, Vidal, without an electric bike going 35 miles past them, right? So these are all the things that I think about. And one last thing, I know you said 22 minutes, but I'm going to wrap up now. I think it's critical to have transit riders in the room when we're making decisions. We're fortunate here to have a board member that rides the service. But we're also fortunate to have board members who understand how what we do connects or intersects with other needs of the community. How do we apply good governance to make sure that we have the confidence of the community to deliver? How do we tie into educational pursuits? How do we intersect there? How do we intersect in health? How do we intersect in business? How do we show those values? So I think, having the rider's voice in the room, critical. Maybe even more critical is having the folks that work in the system be riders as well. I think that's probably critical as well. But I applaud the work that you've brought today. And again, I'm in the church with you. I agree with everything that you said and look forward to hearing more. Thank you.
Susan, do you want to come up or do you want us to run a microphone to you? Can we get Susan a microphone? Susan Siegel is the Executive Director of Mobility International USA. And what are your reactions?
Thank you so much, Rob, and thank you so much, Anna. You are an amazing disability rights activist, and it's an honor to know you and hear about the work you do. I just wanted to add one more element to this amazing gathering, and I'm assuming it's an issue for other people here as well. And I've been working with the mayor on this, so we're on the same team. And that is, we pride ourselves as being one of the most accessible cities in the whole world. And I bring thousands of people from all over the world to Eugene, and they're like amazed by this amazing city. But the one part right now, besides the sidewalks, that we haven't done a right job is we have no accessible taxis, Uber, or Lyfts, right? No accessible taxis, Uber, or Lyfts. And for many of us, we should have the exact same options as non-disabled people. And so I've been working with the mayor that, my thing is that we should never even contract with any of these services till these services are accessible to everybody. So we're looking at ways, how do we fix this going forward in a short amount of time so that everybody here, if you want, like tonight, to call a Uber, taxi, or Lyft, and you're in a wheelchair or power chair and can't use a regular vehicle, you have the same right as everybody else. So thank you for everybody who's working on this. And Anna, you are an amazing disability activist. Thank you for the work that you're doing. And thank you, Best, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Anna. There's a lot I could say right now. I would just reflect, I was really impressed of all the different kinds of people and people you've interacted with and individuals that you highlighted. And I didn't see in that you're an urban person or a rural person or red person or blue person. What I got, you're American. This is all of us, is that if not us, then people we know or people will become or people used to be may not be able to drive. And I think that I know there's an opportunity to build on that commonality. I think that we tend to see issues today as this way or that way, black versus white. And I think we can all agree that we all just want to get where we want to go. figure out how to do that. There's a lot of work we have to do. BEST is a little bit of that part of work. We work with lots of others. We bring people together. We create educational events like this. We're happy to do that. But I'm looking forward and following up in the conversation with you and others in this room, our cycle change activists, with Mayor Knutson, with LTD and your mobility management plan, and making things better for all of us. So thank you so much for being here tonight. We've got this room for a while. There's plenty of food. Charlotte, come on up. Or speak from the mic, however you want to do it. Thank you. Thank you for the hand signals.
Hello? Hey, it works. So some of you may have noticed with varying levels of visibility and vision in the room, I have just created a mural that has the key essential messages that Anna and some of the other speakers have said. We want to make sure we hear your stories as well. So in the back of the room, in a couple of places, there's some fun markers to add. I'm usually pretty good at getting those main messages, but sometimes I miss stuff. So come add your mark here, and if it's feeling like too scary, you're going to say, oh no, it's too pretty, I can't do that. I'll do it for you. So there's lots of space here to add if we've missed anything, and lots of space in the back. Make Eugene better when driving is not an option. So we're always looking for ways to improve. Thanks.
Thank you, Charlotte. So this program is being recorded on Zoom and live streaming, and we'll post that. Charlotte will take a photo of your graphic recording and post that as well, and pick up some of the themes and some of the good ideas here and post this back. We have your contact information, and we'll let you know of future opportunities to be involved. For right now, as I'm saying, we've got a ton of food. Please help us eat it. Take it home with you. We've got some of Anna's books for sale. There are a lot that were pre-ordered, and she's going to be signing that. And thank you so much for being here tonight. Thank you, everyone.